The rain hammered the asphalt like bullets from heaven, each drop exploding against the dark streets of downtown Chicago. Luca Romano stepped out of his black Cadillac, the heavy door closing with a finality that seemed to echo through the empty streets. The meeting with the Torino family had gone exactly as expected. Threats disguised as negotiations, promises wrapped in barbed wire. Nothing new in his world. At 35, Luca had built an empire from concrete and fear. His tailored charcoal suit remained pristine despite the storm, as if even nature knew better than to challenge him. But tonight felt different. The weight in his chest had nothing to do with the loaded Beretta beneath his jacket or the envelope of photographs in his inside pocket, evidence of betrayals that would need answering. He was about to signal his driver when he saw her. Under the flickering streetlight at the corner of Michigan and Harrison, a young woman sat crumpled against a brick wall. Her scrubs were soaked through, the pale blue fabric clinging to her slight frame. Rain streamed down her face, mixing with tears that caught the amber light. In her trembling hands, she clutched a photograph, the edges worn, the corners bent from desperate gripping. Isabella Chen had been sitting there for 2 hours, though she'd lost track of time somewhere between the third wave of sobs and the realization that she truly had nowhere left to go. The hospital identification badge that had once hung proudly from her neck was gone, confiscated along with her dignity and her faith in justice. Her apartment keys were useless now. The landlord had made it clear that without her nursing salary, she had 48 hours to collect her belongings. But it was the photograph that hurt most. Her mother's face, serene and smiling, taken just 6 months before the cancer diagnosis, before the medical bills started piling up like accusations, before Isabella had made the desperate decision to work double shifts in the ICU, trying to save enough for the experimental treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. Luca found himself walking toward her before his mind could construct a reasonable explanation. In 20 years of controlling Chicago's South Side, he'd learned to trust his instincts. They'd kept him alive when logic might have gotten him killed. But this was different. This wasn't about territory or revenge or the careful balance of power that governed his world. "You lost something?" His voice carried the rough edges of a man who rarely had to repeat himself. Isabella looked up, her hazel eyes wide with the particular terror of someone who had already lost everything and now faced losing more. She took in his expensive suit, the dangerous stillness in his posture, the way shadows seemed to gather around him like old friends. "Just everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the divide of their worlds. Luca saw the hospital scrubs, the exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue, the way she held that photograph like a lifeline. Isabella saw a man who could either save her or destroy what little remained of her life, and wasn't sure which possibility frightened her more. Without a word, Luca shrugged out of his jacket and held it toward her. The gesture was so unexpected that Isabella hesitated, certain there must be a catch, a price she couldn't afford to pay. "Take it," he said simply. "Storm's not letting up anytime soon." The jacket was warm from his body heat and smelled of expensive cologne and something indefinably masculine. As Isabella pulled it around her shoulders, she felt the weight of it, heavier than seemed reasonable for fabric and thread. She didn't know about the gun, about the photographs, about the blood money in the inner pocket. She only knew that for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than the bone-deep cold of despair. "My car's across the street," Luca said. "I know a place where you can get warm, get some food, no strings." Isabella's mother had taught her to be wary of strangers, especially men who offered help without explanation. But her mother had also taught her that sometimes, when you're drowning, you take the hand that's offered and ask questions later. "Are you going to hurt me?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended. Luca studied her face, the bruised shadows under her eyes, the way she held herself like someone expecting another blow. "If I meant to hurt you, you wouldn't be here to ask that question." It wasn't exactly reassuring, but something in his tone suggested truth. Isabella nodded slowly and let him help her to her feet. Her legs were unsteady, whether from sitting in the cold rain or from the surreal nature of accepting help from a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a crime novel. As they crossed the street to his car, Isabella caught sight of herself in the tinted windows. The woman looking back was a stranger, hair plastered to her skull, clothes hanging like rags, eyes hollow with grief and exhaustion. 6 months ago, she'd been Isabella Martinez, ICU nurse with impeccable credentials and unshakable dedication to healing. Now she was just another casualty of a system that had failed her when she needed it most. The driver, a mountain of a man with scarred knuckles, opened the rear door without question. If he was surprised to see his boss helping a bedraggled woman into the back seat, his face betrayed nothing. In Luca Romano's organization, curiosity was a luxury few could afford. The car's interior was warm and quiet, insulated from the storm and the world outside. Isabella sank into leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and tried not to think about how many rules she was breaking, how many warning signs she was ignoring. But the alternative was going back to that corner, to the rain and the cold and the crushing weight of having nowhere left to turn. "Where are we going?" she asked as the car pulled away from the curb. "Somewhere safe," Luca replied, and something in his voice made her believe it might actually be true. The Meridian Cafe occupied the ground floor of a brownstone that had seen better decades. From the outside, it looked like any other late-night diner trying to survive in a neighborhood that gentrification had forgotten. The neon sign flickered intermittently, casting uneven light on rain-slicked windows. Isabella couldn't see the armed guards positioned at strategic points around the building, or the surveillance cameras hidden behind false storefronts. She only saw warm light spilling onto the sidewalk and the promise of shelter. Luca led her through the front entrance, past empty booths with cracked vinyl seats and a coffee machine that had been brewing the same pot since the Carter administration. But instead of stopping at the counter, he guided her toward a door marked private in faded gold lettering. "Tony," he called to the elderly man behind the register. "We need the upstairs dining room. And send up some food, something warm." The old man nodded with the practiced indifference of someone who'd learned long ago not to ask questions. As they climbed the narrow staircase, Isabella caught glimpses of the real business conducted below. The quiet conversations in corner booths, the exchange of envelopes, the careful choreography of men who dealt in currencies other than cash. The upstairs dining room was a revelation. Where the downstairs maintained its working-class camouflage, this space spoke of old-world elegance. Dark wood paneling reflected the warm glow of table lamps, and the windows overlooked a courtyard garden that somehow thrived despite the urban decay surrounding it. It was the kind of place where important decisions were made over expensive wine and handshake agreements. Isabella stood dripping on the hardwood floor, acutely aware of how out of place she looked. The scrubs that had once represented her professional identity now marked her as an intruder in this carefully constructed world. She wrapped Luca's jacket tighter around herself, grateful for its weight and warmth. "Sit," Luca said, gesturing toward a table by the window. "Food will be up in a minute." As if summoned by his words, Tony appeared with a tray bearing a bowl of soup that steamed like incense, fresh bread that filled the room with the scent of yeast and hope, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Isabella realized she hadn't eaten in nearly 18 hours, hadn't felt hungry in longer than that, but the first spoonful of minestrone awakened her body's desperate need for sustenance. Luca watched her eat with the focused attention of a man accustomed to reading people. The way she held the spoon spoke of good manners maintained despite desperation. The careful way she broke the bread suggested someone who understood the value of making things last. Most telling was how she paused between bites, as if afraid the food might disappear if she seemed too eager. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Isabella paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. "Yesterday, I think. Maybe the day before. Time's been difficult to track lately. The hospital scrubs. You're a nurse." It wasn't a question, but Isabella nodded anyway. Was. Past tense, as of this morning. She took another spoonful of soup, buying time before continuing. "There was an incident. A patient died, and they needed someone to blame. I was convenient." Luca leaned back in his chair, studying her face in the lamplight. In his world, blame was currency, traded and exchanged according to the complex mathematics of power and survival. But there was something in Isabella's voice. A resignation that spoke of truth rather than convenient excuse. "What kind of incident?" Isabella set down her spoon and looked directly at him for the first time since entering the cafe. Her eyes were the color of autumn leaves, flecked with gold that caught the light when she wasn't crying. "Vincent Torino was brought in 3 weeks ago. Gunshot wound to the chest. Critical condition. I was assigned to his care." The name hit Luca like a physical blow. Vincent Torino, his oldest rival, the man whose organization had been encroaching on Romano territory for months. The meeting earlier tonight had been about Torino's increasingly aggressive moves into the South Side drug trade. To learn that Isabella had been involved in his care, however peripherally, changed everything. "He died during my shift," Isabella continued, unaware of the seismic shift her words had created. The administration claimed I'd made an error with his medication, but I know I didn't. Every dosage was verified, every procedure followed exactly. But his family. She paused, swallowing hard. They wanted someone held accountable. The hospital decided it was easier to sacrifice one nurse than fight the Torino family. Luca felt something cold settle in his chest. He knew exactly what had happened to Vincent Torino, because he'd ordered it himself. The contract killer had been instructed to make it look like a complication from surgery, something that could be blamed on medical error rather than deliberate elimination. The plan had worked perfectly, except that an innocent woman had paid the price for his careful plotting. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than she could possibly understand. Isabella shrugged, the gesture made heavy by exhaustion. "Story of my life lately. My mother needs treatment that costs more than I make in 2 years. I was working extra shifts, saving every penny, hoping." She trailed off, looking out at the rain still falling on the courtyard garden. "Hoping for miracles, I suppose. Tell me about your mother." The invitation opened something in Isabella that had been locked tight for weeks. She spoke about Maria Martinez, about the woman who'd raised her alone after Isabella's father disappeared when she was 8, about working 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school, while caring for a mother whose English was limited but whose pride was infinite, about the diagnosis that had come like a meteorite, destroying everything in its path. "She doesn't know I lost my job," Isabella said finally. "She's at Street Catherine's extended care, and I haven't told her because I don't know what comes next. Without insurance, without income." She looked down at the photograph still clutched in her free hand. "She always said I was born to help people. Ironic, isn't it? I can't even help her." Luca stood and walked to the window, ostensibly to look out at the storm but really to hide the expression on his face. In 35 years of life, 20 of them in the family business, he'd made countless decisions that sent ripples through other people's lives. But he'd never been forced to confront the human cost so directly, so immediately. The woman sitting behind him wasn't a statistic or collateral damage. She was the living consequence of his choices. "What if I told you there was a way to help your mother?" he said without turning around. Isabella's laugh held no humor. "Unless you're secretly a billionaire philanthropist, I don't see how that's possible." Luca turned back to face her, his expression serious. "What if I told you I need a nurse? Someone discreet, someone with ICU experience. The pay would be substantial." "I don't work for criminals," Isabella said immediately, though something in her voice suggested the conviction was less solid than her words. "Then work for the people they hurt," Luca replied. "In my line of work, people get injured. Sometimes they can't go to hospitals, can't risk the questions or the paperwork. They need medical care from someone who understands the importance of confidentiality." Isabella stared at him, trying to reconcile the man who'd given her his jacket in the rain with the reality of what he was offering. "You're asking me to be a mob doctor. I'm asking you to be a nurse, to do what you were trained to do, what you're good at. The circumstances might be unconventional, but the medicine is the same. And if I say no..." Luca spread his hands in a gesture that somehow managed to be both threatening and reassuring. "Then you finish your food. I have Tony call you a cab, and you go back to whatever you were doing before tonight. No strings, no obligations." Isabella looked down at the photograph in her lap. Her mother's face smiled up at her, full of hope and pride and unshakable faith in her daughter's ability to overcome any obstacle. Maria Martinez had sacrificed everything to give Isabella opportunities she'd never had. Now it was Isabella's turn to sacrifice. But what, exactly, was she being asked to give up? "How substantial is substantial?" she asked. "Enough to cover your mother's treatment. Enough to ensure she gets the best care available. And all I have to do is treat injured criminals? No questions asked?" "The medicine is the same," Luca repeated. "A gunshot wound doesn't care who fired the gun. A broken bone doesn't ask for political affiliations. You'd be doing what you've always done, helping people heal." Isabella closed her eyes and tried to imagine explaining this decision to her mother. Maria Martinez had fled El Salvador to escape violence and corruption, had worked herself nearly to death to build a clean life in America. What would she say if she knew her daughter was considering working for the very kind of men they'd tried so hard to avoid? But then Isabella thought about the experimental treatment, about the hope in her mother's eyes when the oncologist had first mentioned it as a possibility. She thought about dignity and time and the chance to say goodbye properly instead of watching cancer eat away at the only person who'd ever believed in her unconditionally. "I want to see my mother's medical files first," she said finally. "I want to know exactly what treatment you're proposing to fund, and I want input on her care team." Luca nodded. "Reasonable. And I want boundaries. I treat injuries. I don't ask questions about how they happened, but I don't participate in anything illegal beyond that. I'm a nurse, not an accessory." "Agreed." Isabella looked out at the storm still raging beyond the windows. Somewhere in the distance she could hear sirens, ambulances rushing toward emergencies she was no longer qualified to help with, carrying patients to hospitals where she was no longer welcome. But maybe, in this strange new world Luca Romano was offering, she could still be what her mother had always believed her to be, someone who helped people heal. "When do I start?" she asked. The safe house occupied the third floor of a converted warehouse in Pilsen, its industrial bones softened by careful renovation. Medical equipment that belonged in a hospital ICU shared space with reinforced windows and security cameras that tracked every approach to the building. Isabella had spent the morning setting up a makeshift treatment room, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she arranged instruments and medications according to her own carefully developed system. 3 days had passed since the night in the rain. 3 days of phone calls to arrange her mother's transfer to a private facility, of signing contracts she didn't fully understand, of crossing lines she'd never imagined approaching. But when Dr. Reginald Hawthorne had personally assured her that Maria Martinez would receive the experimental immunotherapy treatment, Isabella had felt something she'd forgotten existed. Hope. Now, as she prepared to treat her first patient in Luca Romano's world, that hope warred with a dozen different fears. The man on the gurney before her was barely 22, his face pale with shock and blood loss. Marcus Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had taken a bullet in the shoulder during what Luca had described simply as a misunderstanding with the Antonelli family. "How long ago was he shot?" Isabella asked, pulling on latex gloves with movements that were automatic after years in the ICU. 2 hours, replied Tommy Brennan, one of Luca's lieutenants. He was a compact man with prematurely gray hair and the kind of nervous energy that suggested too much coffee and too little sleep. "We would have brought him sooner, but had to make sure we weren't followed." Isabella nodded and began her assessment. The wound was clean, a through-and-through that had missed the major arteries but nicked the subclavian artery enough to cause significant bleeding. In a hospital, this would have been a straightforward trauma case. Here, in a converted warehouse with improvised equipment, it became a test of improvisation and skill. "I'm going to need better light," she said, adjusting the surgical lamp above the gurney. "And someone needs to stay to assist me. Someone with steady hands and a strong stomach." Tommy raised his hand like a reluctant student. "I've helped before. Not with anything this serious, but have you ever seen surgery? Does it count if it was on television?" Despite everything, Isabella found herself almost smiling. Not even close. "But you'll learn." As she worked to clean the wound and assess the damage, Isabella found herself falling into the rhythm she'd perfected over 6 years in trauma medicine. The patient became the center of the universe, everything else fading to background noise. It didn't matter that Marcus Chen was a foot soldier in a criminal organization, or that the man assisting her probably had blood on his hands. What mattered was stopping the bleeding, preventing infection, and ensuring that a young man who'd made questionable life choices lived to possibly make better ones. "Talk to me about the pain," she said to Marcus, who'd been conscious but groggy throughout the procedure. Scale of 1 to 10. "About a 7, he managed, his voice tight with discomfort. "But I've had worse. Worse than a gunshot wound? You should see what happens when you mess up a protection payment to the Kowalski crew," Marcus said with a weak attempt at humor. "Those guys don't believe in quick deaths." Isabella paused in her work, looking down at the young man's face. He couldn't be much older than she'd been when she started nursing school, when the world had seemed full of possibilities instead of compromises. "How did you end up here, Marcus?" "Same as everyone, I guess. Started small, kept getting bigger. My dad was in the life, his dad before him. It's like being born into a family business, you know? Except the business is breaking legs and moving product." "You could leave," Isabella said as she began suturing the exit wound. "Find something else, something legitimate." Marcus was quiet for so long that she thought he might have passed out from the pain medication. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone much older. "You ever try to explain a resume gap that includes 2 years of freelance enforcement work? Besides, this is all I know, all I'm good at." You're good at staying calm under pressure, Isabella observed. That's not nothing. Paramedics, emergency responders, soldiers, they all need that skill. Yeah, but they also need clean records and references that don't end up in federal prison. Isabella finished the final suture and began bandaging the wound. The body has an amazing capacity for healing, she said. Sometimes wounds that look devastating end up leaving barely visible scars. Sometimes what seems like permanent damage turns out to be recoverable. She wasn't talking about the gunshot wound anymore, and something in Marcus's eyes suggested he understood that. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Luca's arrival before he appeared in the doorway. He'd changed from the expensive suit of 3 nights ago into dark jeans and a black sweater that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less formal. His eyes swept the makeshift operating room, taking in the efficiently organized instruments, the properly disposed medical waste, the competent way Isabella had transformed chaos into order. "How is he?" Luca asked. "He'll live," Isabella replied, stripping off her gloves and washing her hands in the industrial sink. "The bullet missed everything vital, but he's going to need antibiotics and rest. No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity for at least 2 weeks. You hear that, Marcus?" Luca's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Doctor's orders." "Yes, sir, Mr. Romano," Marcus replied, struggling to sit up straighter despite his injuries. Isabella watched the interaction with interest. There was respect in Marcus's voice, but also genuine fear. Luca Romano wasn't just a boss to these men. He was the final arbiter of their fates, the difference between living and dying in a world where mistakes were often terminal. "Tommy, take him to the recovery room downstairs," Luca instructed. "Make sure he has everything he needs." As Tommy helped Marcus off the gurney and toward the stairs, Isabella began cleaning up the medical equipment. The familiar routine of post-procedure organization gave her hands something to do while her mind processed what had just happened. She'd treated her first patient as a mob doctor, and the world hadn't ended. More surprisingly, she'd felt useful. For the first time in weeks, her training had meant something, had made a difference in someone's life. "You did good work," Luca said when they were alone. "It's what I do," Isabella replied, not looking up from her organizing, or what I did anyway. "What you still do. What you'll keep doing." Isabella paused in her cleaning and looked at him directly. "Is this what my life is now? Treating gunshot wounds and stab victims in abandoned warehouses? Is that so different from treating them in hospital emergency rooms?" The hospital had oversight, ethics committees, standards of care that couldn't be compromised by other considerations. Luca moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and something else. Something that might have been gunpowder or might have been her imagination. "You think hospitals don't make compromises? You think they don't have their own version of politics and power games?" Isabella thought about the administrators who'd thrown her under the bus to appease the Torino family, about the ethics committee that had rubber-stamped her dismissal without conducting a real investigation. That's different. Is it? Or is it just a cleaner version of the same corruption, dressed up in bureaucracy and mission statements? She didn't have an answer for that, so she returned to her organizing. But Luca's words echoed in her mind, forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about the institutions she'd trusted, the systems she'd believed in. "Your mother starts treatment tomorrow," Luca said after a moment. Isabella's hands stilled on the medical supplies. "Tomorrow? Dr. Hawthorne wants to begin immediately. He thinks the immunotherapy has a better chance of success if they start before the cancer progresses further." Hope and terror warred in Isabella's chest. The treatment she'd dreamed of, planned for, sacrificed everything to afford. It was actually happening, but the cost was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Each patient she treated, each boundary she crossed, each compromise she made was another step away from the woman she'd thought she was. "I want to see her before the treatment begins," Isabella said. "Of course. I'll have someone drive you to the facility." Isabella nodded, still not looking at him. Outside the warehouse windows, Chicago stretched in all directions. 8 million people living their lives according to rules and systems they believed were fair and just. But in this converted medical suite, those rules felt as distant as another planet. Here, there was only the immediate reality of blood and pain, and the strange mercy of a criminal who kept his promises. "Luca," she said as he turned to leave. "Yeah? When this is over, when my mother is better, when the treatment is finished, what happens then?" He paused in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the hallway fluorescence. "Then you decide who you want to be," he said. But that's tomorrow's problem. Today, you saved someone's life. That's not nothing, Isabella. That matters. As his footsteps faded down the stairs, Isabella stood alone in the makeshift operating room, surrounded by the tools of healing and the evidence of violence. Somewhere across the city, her mother was preparing for a treatment that might save her life, funded by money that came from sources Isabella didn't want to examine too closely. The mathematics of survival had become complicated, but the underlying equation remained simple. Do whatever it takes to protect the people you love, even if it meant losing yourself in the process. Street Catherine's extended care had the sterile, hopeful atmosphere of a place where miracles were expected daily but rarely occurred. Isabella walked through corridors that smelled of industrial disinfectant and barely contained desperation, her nurse-trained eyes automatically cataloging the efficiency of the staff, the quality of the equipment, the subtle signs that separated premium care from warehousing for the dying. Her mother's room was on the 4th floor, with windows that overlooked a garden where patients in wheelchairs sat beneath trees that were just beginning to hint at autumn color. Maria Martinez had been moved here 2 days ago, and the transformation was remarkable. Gone was the shared room at the county facility, the overworked staff who barely had time to check vital signs, the constant noise of too many patients crammed into insufficient space. "Mija," Maria said as Isabella entered, her face lighting up with the smile that had sustained them both through 27 years of struggle. "Look at this place. It's like a hotel, but with better nurses." Isabella forced herself to return the smile, though guilt sat in her stomach like broken glass. The private room with its comfortable furniture and state-of-the-art monitoring equipment represented everything she'd dreamed of providing for her mother. But the price, the compromise of every principle she'd thought she valued, made the victory taste like ashes. "How are you feeling, Mama?" Isabella asked, settling into the chair beside the bed. Her mother looked smaller than she remembered, the cancer eating away at her frame despite the best nutritional support money could buy. "Better," Maria replied, and Isabella could see that it was true. The constant worry that had lined her mother's face for months had eased, replaced by something Isabella hadn't seen in far too long: hope. Dr. Hawthorne explained about the new treatment. "He says it's very promising for cases like mine." Isabella took her mother's hand, feeling the frailty of bones that had once seemed unbreakable. "The immunotherapy is experimental, Mama. We have to be realistic about expectations." "Mija, I've been realistic for 62 years. It's exhausting." Maria's laugh was weaker than it used to be, but it still carried the music that had been the soundtrack of Isabella's childhood. "For once, I want to be unrealistic. I want to believe in impossible things." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the garden through the window. Isabella tried to memorize the moment. Her mother's hand in hers, the afternoon light painting everything golden, the sound of life continuing beyond the walls of illness and fear. If this treatment failed, there might not be many more moments like this. "Isabella," Maria said eventually, her voice taking on the tone that had always preceded difficult conversations. "This place, this treatment, how are we paying for it?" The question Isabella had been dreading since signing the contracts. She'd prepared a dozen different answers, each one a careful mixture of truth and omission designed to protect her mother from the ugly reality of their situation. "There was an insurance settlement," Isabella said, the lie sliding off her tongue with disturbing ease. "From the hospital. They admitted some irregularities in my termination." Maria studied her daughter's face with the intensity of someone who'd spent 27 years reading her expressions. "Isabella Maria Martinez, you are many things, but you have never been a good liar." Isabella felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble under her mother's knowing gaze. "Mama, whatever you did," Maria said firmly, "whatever compromise you made, I need you to know that I understand. Sometimes love requires us to do things that our hearts don't want to do. You don't know what I did. I know you. I know that you would walk through fire for the people you love, and I know that you would never hurt anyone unless you had no choice." Maria squeezed Isabella's hand with surprising strength. "I also know that guilt is a luxury we can't afford right now. You found a way to give me hope, Mija. Let me be grateful for that without having to carry your shame too." Isabella felt tears threatening for the first time since the night in the rain. "I'm supposed to be the one taking care of you. You are. But taking care of someone doesn't mean protecting them from every truth, from every consequence. It means trusting them to understand that love sometimes requires difficult choices." Before Isabella could respond, a soft knock at the door announced the arrival of Dr. Hawthorne. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with the kind of confidence that came from decades of fighting death and occasionally winning. His reputation in oncology was nearly mythical. Patients traveled from around the world for the chance to be treated by him. "Miss Martinez," he said, nodding to Isabella before addressing her mother. "Mrs. Martinez, I wanted to discuss the treatment protocol with both of you before we begin tomorrow." As Dr. Hawthorne explained the complexities of immunotherapy, the way they would reprogram her mother's immune system to recognize and attack the cancer cells, the potential side effects, the careful monitoring required, Isabella found herself thinking about another kind of programming. How did someone reprogram themselves to accept a life of moral compromise? How did you teach your conscience to recognize new definitions of right and wrong? The success rate for your specific type of cancer is approximately 65%, Dr. Hawthorne was saying. Those are very encouraging odds, but I want you both to understand that this is still an experimental treatment. We're essentially teaching your immune system to fight a war it's never fought before. And if it doesn't work? Maria asked with the practical directness that had carried her through decades of hardship. Then we explore other options. But I've reviewed your case extensively, Mrs. Martinez, and I believe you're an excellent candidate for this treatment. Your overall health is good, you've responded well to the preparatory medications, and your attitude. He smiled. Hope is actually a measurable factor in treatment outcomes. Patients who believe they can get better often do better. After Dr. Hawthorne left, Isabella and her mother sat together as evening approached. The garden outside the window grew dark, but the room remained warm and bright, filled with machines that hummed with the promise of healing. "There's something else I need to tell you," Isabella said finally. "I've taken a new job. It's different from hospital nursing. The hours might be irregular, and I might not be able to visit as often as I'd like." "What kind of job?" Isabella chose her words carefully. "Private medical care, for people who need treatment but can't go to hospitals." Maria was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful attention she'd always given to her daughter's choices. Dangerous people? People in difficult situations. "Isabella, look at me." When their eyes met, Maria's expression was serious but not afraid. "Your whole life, you've wanted to help people heal. If these difficult people need healing, then maybe this is where you're supposed to be. Maybe this is how you use the gifts God gave you. You're not disappointed? Ashamed? Mija, the only thing that would disappoint me is if you let fear stop you from being who you're meant to be. You have healing in your hands and compassion in your heart. The world needs those things, even the parts of the world that don't seem to deserve them." As Isabella drove back across the city that night, her mother's words echoed in her mind. The streets of Chicago looked different now, as if she were seeing them through new eyes. The well-lit neighborhoods where law-abiding citizens lived their orderly lives, and the darker corners where desperation and violence held their own kind of court. Both worlds needed healing, she realized. The difference was that one world could afford to be selective about where that healing came from. Her phone buzzed with a text from Luca. "Emergency at the warehouse. Can you be there in an hour?" Isabella stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "On my way." As she changed course toward Pilsen, Isabella thought about programming and reprogramming, about immune systems learning to fight new wars. Maybe her mother was right. Maybe this was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not despite her principles, but because of them. Maybe healing wasn't about the circumstances that brought people to your table, but about what you did for them once they were there. The city blurred past her windows as she drove toward whatever emergency waited in the shadows, carrying with her the weight of her mother's faith and the strange, growing certainty that she was finally becoming exactly who she was meant to be. The warehouse felt different when Isabella arrived, charged with an energy that made her medical instincts go on high alert. There were more cars than usual parked outside, and the men standing guard carried their weapons with the casual visibility of soldiers expecting battle. Tommy Brennan met her at the entrance, his usually nervous demeanor replaced by something harder. "3 of them," he said without preamble as they climbed the stairs. "Torino's boys decided to send a message about territory, got a little more than they bargained for." Isabella nodded, her mind automatically shifting into trauma assessment mode. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Luca's been keeping them stable, but..." Tommy shrugged, a gesture that conveyed everything he couldn't say aloud. The makeshift medical suite had been transformed into something resembling a battlefield triage unit. 3 gurneys held young men in various states of distress, and the air carried the metallic smell of blood mixed with the sharp tang of disinfectant. Luca stood between 2 of the patients, His sleeves rolled up and his hands stained red despite the latex gloves he wore. "Thank God," he said when he saw Isabella. "I've been trying to keep them stable, but this is way beyond basic first aid." Isabella surveyed the scene with professional efficiency. Patient 1. Gunshot wound to the leg. Significant bleeding, but not immediately life-threatening. Patient 2. Knife wound to the abdomen. Potentially serious depending on what internal organs had been hit. Patient 3. Unconscious. Head trauma evident from the way his pupils responded to light. "I need them triaged," she said, pulling on gloves and moving toward the most critical case. "Head trauma gets priority, then abdominal wound, then the leg. Tommy, I need you to assist with patient 1. Apply pressure here, and don't let up until I say so." "What about patient 3? Luca asked, stepping back to give her room to work. "Hold his head steady and talk to him. Keep talking, even if he doesn't respond." "His name? Danny Castellano. He's 19. Isabella began her assessment of Danny's head injury, her hands moving with practiced precision as she checked pupil response, tested reflexes, palpated for fractures. The boy, and he was a boy, barely older than Marcus had been, showed signs of serious concussion but no obvious skull fractures. Still, head injuries were unpredictable. In a hospital, he'd be getting a CT scan within minutes. "Danny," she said loudly, shining a penlight into his eyes. "Danny, can you hear me? You're safe now, but I need you to wake up." "Is he going to be okay?" Luca asked, his voice carrying an edge Isabella hadn't heard before. "Too early to tell. Head injuries are tricky. Sometimes minor trauma causes major problems. Sometimes major trauma resolves without complications. The key is keeping him conscious and monitoring for changes." As she worked, Isabella became aware of the careful choreography happening around her. Men moved through the warehouse with purpose, some leaving with weapons, others arriving with reports. She caught fragments of conversation, addresses, names, discussions of retaliation and response. The medical crisis was only one front in whatever war was being fought tonight. "The abdominal wound is the next priority," Isabella said, moving to the second gurney. The patient, she heard someone call him Rico, was conscious but pale, his vital signs indicating possible internal bleeding. "I need to know exactly what happened here." "Kitchen knife," Rico managed between gritted teeth. The Torino kid got lucky with his swing. Isabella began cutting away Rico's shirt to better assess the wound. The entry point was about 3 inches below his ribcage, angled upward. Dangerous territory. Liver, kidneys, major vessels all within the potential path of the blade. "This needs surgery," she said to Luca. "Real surgery, in a real hospital. I can stabilize him, but if there's internal bleeding—" "No hospitals," Rico said firmly. "Can't risk it." "You could die," Isabella replied bluntly. "Better than spending life in federal prison." Isabella looked at Luca, who shrugged. "His choice," he said simply. For a moment, Isabella felt the full weight of the world she'd entered. In a hospital, patient welfare was the primary concern. Here, other considerations took precedence. Considerations she was only beginning to understand. But Rico's pulse was getting weaker, and his skin was taking on the grayish pallor that indicated shock. "Then we do what we can here," she said. "But I need real equipment. This improvised setup isn't going to cut it for exploratory surgery." "What do you need?" Luca asked. Isabella rattled off a list of surgical equipment that would have been commonplace in any operating room but seemed almost impossible to acquire in a warehouse. Luca listened without comment, then pulled out his phone and began making calls. While they waited for equipment, Isabella did what she could to stabilize all 3 patients. Danny regained consciousness but remained groggy and confused. The leg wound, once properly cleaned and bandaged, proved to be less serious than it initially appeared. But Rico continued to deteriorate, his body going into shock despite her best efforts. "How long for the equipment?" she asked Luca. 20 minutes. Maybe less." Isabella checked Rico's pulse again and felt her heart sink. "I don't think we have 20 minutes." The next few hours became a blur of improvised medicine and desperate measures. When the surgical equipment arrived, apparently borrowed from a veterinary clinic owned by someone who owed Luca a favor, Isabella found herself performing surgery under conditions that would have horrified her professors. But Rico's body didn't care about sterile environments or proper protocols. It only cared about stopping the bleeding that was slowly killing him. Luca assisted with the competence of someone who'd seen too much trauma, his hands steady as he held retractors and suctioned blood. Tommy managed the other 2 patients, following Isabella's instructions with growing confidence. Together, They formed an unlikely surgical team united by the immediate imperative of saving lives. There, Isabella said finally, locating the source of internal bleeding and managing to repair the damaged vessel. That should hold him. Rico's vital signs began to stabilize, his color slowly improving as his body responded to the intervention. Isabella sutured the internal layers with meticulous care, knowing that in this environment, infection was as dangerous as the original injury. "You saved his life," Luca said as they finally finished closing the incision. "We saved his life," Isabella corrected. "I couldn't have done it alone." As dawn approached, the warehouse gradually returned to something approaching normal. The 3 patients were stable and resting in the recovery area downstairs. The other men had dispersed to whatever business occupied their daylight hours. Isabella sat in the medical suite, exhaustion weighing on her like a physical presence. "Coffee?" Luca asked, appearing with 2 steaming mugs. Isabella accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth. "Do you ever question it?" she asked after a moment. "Question what?" "This life. The violence. The constant threat of retaliation. The way you all accept that getting stabbed or shot is just part of the job." Luca was quiet for a long time, staring out the windows at the city waking up beyond the industrial district. "Every day," he said finally. "But questioning it and changing it are 2 different things. This world has rules, just like yours did. Break the rules. Face the consequences. The consequences in my world were losing a job, not losing a life. Are you sure about that? How many people died because they couldn't afford treatment? How many suffered because hospitals prioritized profits over patients? Your world just hides its violence behind bureaucracy and insurance forms." Isabella couldn't argue with that. She'd seen too many patients deteriorate while waiting for approval for treatments, too many families destroyed by medical bills that transformed healing into bankruptcy. "So what's the answer?" she asked. "Maybe there isn't one," Luca replied. "Maybe there's just doing the best you can with the choices you're given." As Isabella prepared to leave the warehouse that morning, she realized something had shifted inside her. The woman who'd sat crying in the rain a week ago had been someone who believed in clear moral lines, in systems that worked, in the possibility of doing pure good in an impure world. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that healing sometimes required getting blood on your hands. Her phone buzzed with a text from the hospital where her mother was receiving treatment. "Initial response to immunotherapy excellent. Dr. Hawthorne very encouraged." Isabella smiled as she read the message, feeling something like peace settle in her chest. Outside the warehouse, Chicago was going about its morning business. People heading to jobs where they dealt in legal currencies, where their decisions could be explained to their children, where the consequences of their actions could be published in annual reports. But in the shadows of that legitimate world, other people made other choices. They chose loyalty over safety, family over law, survival over principles. And sometimes, Isabella was beginning to understand. They chose to trust a nurse who'd learned that healing wasn't about the circumstances that brought people to your table. It was about what you did for them once they were there. As she drove home through the brightening city, Isabella thought about programming and reprogramming, about immune systems learning to fight new wars. Her mother's body was learning to battle cancer cells it had never recognized as enemies. Isabella's conscience was learning to recognize new definitions of right and wrong. Both transformations, she realized, were forms of survival.